Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Sally Uren. I am the CEO of Forum for the Future. We are a sustainable development non-profit with a big mission to accelerate transformation towards a sustainable future, which is why I'm so delighted to be here today to introduce our panel, where we'll be looking at how can we make Scope 3 emissions reductions a reality and look at some of the complexities that are associated with Scope 3 emission reductions, all with a view to really try and draw actionable insights that can be shared amongst our panelists, but shared more broadly as we tackle what we know is a really complex challenge of decarbonisation of Scope 3. So we have a wonderful group of panelists today with us. We have Gayle Schueller, who's the SVP and CSO at 3M, who are one of our co-hosts along with the UNFCCC. We have Giovanni Tula, who's the CSO of Enel Green Power. And then we have Marc, Hamy, VP Corporate Affairs of Airbus. And then, last but by no means least, we have Lene Kristiansen, Senior Director of Sustainability for GE Renewable Energy. So 4 really interesting organizations, all with a set of complex challenges when it comes to emissions in Scope 3 in manufacturing. And we're going to be drawing out some insights, as I say, hopefully, that will enable faster acceleration towards net zero in our Scope 3 emissions. So you're very welcome. In terms of the format for this afternoon, we have a few questions to ask of our panelists, and then we'd like to come to you. So if there's anything that you hear that sparks your interest, in fact, if you hear something midway through, please put your hand up, we can come to you, but we'll definitely come to you towards the end of the discussion and hear if you have any questions, any comments. So please stay with us, please be engaged, because we would really like to bring you in as part of this conversation. And moreover, we'd like to run this as a dialogue. I know it's a strange environment to have a conversation, but that's really what we'd like to do today, an open, honest, candid conversation, really exploring some of the complexities associated with Scope 3 carbon emission reductions. Are you in the right place? Marvellous. Great. Well, I'm going to turn to Gayle first, who is one of our co-hosts. And I have the same question for all 4 panelists, but I think we'll hear 4 quite different answers. But for each of them, I'd like to know a bit more about your carbon journey, your path to carbon neutrality. How are you approaching Scope 1, 2, and critically 3? What's going well? What are you really pleased about? And where might those challenges lie? Gayle, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, well, welcome everyone. It's great to have you here and an honor to be part of the UNFCCC and be here together. So thanks, Sally, so much for opening with us. So 3M is an old company. We've been around 120 years. And that means that there's a lot that we've been learning and evolving and basing on our scientific expertise since that time. Since 2002, we've actually reduced our Scope 1 and 2 emissions more than 70% on an absolute basis. So this idea of carbon reduction isn't new for us, but the world is changing and we recognize we need to do more and we need to do more faster. So we've been reporting on our sustainability goals, including carbon emissions, since 1990, and every year in our annual report. In 2015, we established 15 sustainability goals, including carbon emissions reductions, helping our customers reduce their carbon emissions, and for the first time, a renewable energy goal. We set up our framework as our priorities around sustainability to be uniquely based on that science that drives us as an enterprise. We'll probably end up talking more about that later. But on a framework of science for circular, advancing a global circular economy, science for climate, helping others and collaborating to decarbonize industry around the world, and science for community, because we know we don't do these things alone. It has to be done in collaboration with others. So the centerpiece around science for climate when we first started those pillars was about renewable energy. We achieved our 10-year renewable energy goal in 3 years. There were some people who didn't believe it was possible. I'll tell you, I actually really did. I was seeing what was happening, and I see what's happening now, whether it's renewable with energy growing, whether it's electric vehicles growing, whether it's this conversion towards a just transition. I see the momentum building, but we have to keep pushing it. We have to keep driving. So in addition, we doubled down on renewable energy, and I'm delighted to tell you that we've already have run rates on a daily basis of 50% global sources of electricity from renewables already. It's a really important piece of our milestone, but it's just one piece. So we've already reduced that 70% emissions. We've gone to 50% renewables. We've made goals now where we're committed to scope 1 and 2 carbon emissions reduction by an additional 50% by 2030 and to carbon neutrality by 2050. You'll notice I didn't say that we've committed to the scope 3 piece. The scope 3 piece is really difficult for us. As a diverse manufacturer, from consumer products to healthcare to transportation and electronics and various types of industrial solutions, we have we have over 55,000 products and roughly an equal amount of suppliers. So when it gets to scope 3 and all the different application spaces that these go into, this is something that we haven't yet figured out. We're really the science-based company committed to math with a path for every goal that we set, whether it's our water improvements, water usage, water quality, water transitions, energy, or waste. We have this commitment to a math with a path, and we're critically right now working very hard in partnership with suppliers and customers to address that scope 3 emission. So that's one of the reasons I'm so excited about this topic here, is because we need to work together to make that happen. And I look forward to the day when we can make that commitment, but it's not today.
Thank you, and thank you for that candor, Gayle. When you think about the complexity of, those thousands of suppliers and thousands of products, in terms of really understanding that ambition around scope 3, what is the biggest challenge that you see there? Is it just simply the sheer number of products, or what is the big challenge there, if you could call it out? Yeah, so getting into the depth of understanding and working with our customers, candidly, on how those products are used, getting them qualified. We have representation from the energy and transportation industry here with us right now. And those are some of the longer lead types of industries to make transitions. With our consumer business, we can do that pretty fast. Healthcare is tricky because it's about regulations and it's all different parts of the world. But when we go into some of these longer term types of industries, and maybe you guys will prove me wrong, but even though the transformations are well underway in transportation and in energy, as we've talked about with electrifying transportation and renewable energy in the grid, it actually takes a lot of time to move from the way we've always done things to that just transition for the future. Okay. Thank you very much for that. And thank you for mentioning just transition. It's a phrase, as I've been listening to conversations here at COP, I have heard it mentioned in some quarters, but perhaps not enough. So I'm really happy that you've brought that up, because it's really important we make the transition to net zero, but it has to be a just transition. So thank you for raising that. Giovanni, hello, thank you for joining us. I'd love to hear about Enel Green Power's approach to carbon neutrality, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, I can confirm that just transition is a real priority. I mean, it's a matter of leading not just the transformation that is happening in our case in the energy sector, but it's leading this transition in order to not leaving anyone behind. That is very, very important. And Enel on that is a leader. I mean, is giving a great contribution on that, because we have started this journey towards renewable energy, talking about renewables many years ago. I'm talking about more than 1 decade ago, when it wasn't really popular, talking about or investing on renewables. There were just a visionary bunch of people that believed in the potential of renewables. But at a certain point in time, investing on renewables, Enel has made a strategic move. This strategic move was not only to invest in renewables, but to make renewables the core business for the power generation. And that's what is happening now. Basically, on the one hand, we are investing in renewables. We are the largest private players by additional capacity, by installed capacity in renewables. And we have also an objective of multiply by 3 to triple our installed capacity by 2030, which is an amazing objective for a company, for a utility. And on the other side, we have also committed in the coal phase out, more renewable and less coal. And that's what is happening. At the beginning, we had a plan for the coal phase out by a target for 2030 that has been accelerated, and now we expect to shut down all the plant by 2027. And this strategic move basically allowed us to set a very ambitious target in terms of Scope 1 emissions for the, direct emissions. And we plan to reduce by 80% our direct emission by 2030. And this is already happening. I mean, because every year we are decreasing the emissions of CO2 more and more. And this target has been also certified by the SBTi, the Science Based Initiative, in compliance with, consistent with the 1.5 degrees pathway. You know, I'm talking about Scope 1 emissions because for the utility, this is, of course, the first priority, you know. But it's not all, as you said, Gayle, because it's also a matter of Scope 3, of supply chain, where basically the good news for renewable industry is that Scope 3 is significant, but not as much as Scope 1, you know, because renewable, solar, and wind, they have a very low carbon footprint, but they have. So we are working on that. We are now working with our suppliers to try to, you know, to figure out how to fix the problems, the challenges that you highlight. Because we are, you know, one of the most difficult things to do is to engage with a lot of suppliers, a very fragmented supply chain, especially when the CO2 emissions are buried deeply into the supply chain and we do not have any contact with that. But there is another topic very important, it's the data, information. It's so difficult to set targets today because there are not reliable data and there are not effective traceability systems in place. And that's another part that has to be fixed in order to make some improvement and also to report these improvements. And last point is about to find the incentive mechanism for companies to decarbonize their businesses, their operation, regardless of the region where they operate. Because if they are in Europe, of course, they are part of the emissions trading and so on. But the manufacturing happens in other countries. We should be innovative on that, to find other mechanisms that can help those companies, can make this more attractive for all the suppliers.
Great, thank you very much. Do you actually have at the moment a target for your Scope 3 emissions?
Not yet. We are working on it. I think that we are revising our, commitment to net zero. At the moment, we have committed to be net zero by 2050. Yeah. But we are working to, make it more challenging and also to include Scope 3 in the net zero. It's going to come. I hope soon.
Well, congratulations on the 80% reduction by 2030. That's the kind of number I like to hear. So that sounds great. Brilliant. Well, I'm going to go to Lene next, actually, if I may. Same question. Tell us about your carbon neutrality journey, a bit more about Scope 1, 2, and 3, what you're really proud of, pleased with, and your challenges.
Well, that could be a long speech. Thank you so much, Sally. That's really helpful. And actually, we are a part of Enel's supply chain, and I can echo what everyone's already said, that the complexity is really when you go further down the chain. But I think there's probably also some of the stuff we can highlight today as what we can do, because we are all aware, we're all here. It's quite an encouraging thing to know that we're all focusing on the right things. So for our journey to carbon neutrality, I think I'm going to give you a little bit of a look back in the engine room. So I've been in the wind industry for almost 15 years, started in a blade manufacturing business. That's proper manufacturing, where you generate waste, you use electricity. There's actual activity going on where you also create some mess that needs to be done with. And that was sort of our starting point in Enel Wind Power back in the day, that was later on acquired into Renewable Energy. And we would look at that first. But that's actually already looking at your Scope 3. So it's not just the energy piece, it's not just how we consume electricity green, which is so aligned with our industry that we're in. And of course, there's also another sort of imperative to do so. We looked a little bit further, actually. So we looked at some of our Scope 3 emissions from our operations. We started to map the footprint from logistics of incoming material and also when it went out. Or at least we're doing that in renewable energy now. We looked at how people get to work, because there's a huge piece of awareness and employee engagement that is critical in making this journey as well. And just bearing in mind that we're employees in large companies and we have a voice as such, but we're also consumers. We're also citizens in local communities that might want to actually have more renewable energy generated. And there are all sorts of barriers potentially for why that doesn't always happen. So there's an education piece that we've built into our program as well for carbon neutral operations as a start for Enel Wind Power, and then taking that into Renewable Energy over time. So LM Wind Power has been carbon neutral, so that's one of the subsidiaries in renewable energy, carbon neutral since 2018 for its operations, scope 1, 2, and the operational scope 3. So logistics, waste, employee commuting, business travel. And then we've had a commitment similarly at a G renewable energy level, so for onshore, offshore, hydro, grid, and renewable hybrids business as well for 2020. So actually we were carbon neutral for our operations already from 2020 in G renewable energy. But the big scope 3, I mean, the tricky stuff, right, is really all the materials, all the stuff that goes into the product. And we know that's where the bulk of our emissions sit. So that's the next piece. And G as a corporation has made commitments as well. So all of G, I'm representing G Renewable Energy today, but all of G has made commitments for carbon neutral operations 2030. So all of our facilities worldwide. And then a net zero company commitment for 2050. And obviously, even though some of you probably heard that G is going through a little bit of change these days, the commitment to carbon neutral is that I cannot imagine that will go away, and we will only sort of accelerate in the individual businesses as we will need to, also in line with our customers and the markets around us. So that it's been a long journey, and I think it's fair to say that we haven't figured it out, so we're not going to give all the solutions today, but we can certainly share what we've done and where we are today and how we see the future.
Great, thank you for that. And when you think about your scope 3 supply chain emissions today, what, again, similar question that I asked to Gayle, what do you see as the biggest challenge?
The complexity. And again, because we have a varied portfolio of products, so we're not just a wind turbine manufacturer, for instance, we actually have the whole range of renewable energy technologies, and it means very different value chains, very different supply chains,
Okay.
and some of that is just tricky.
Yeah.
So for us, it's actually encouraging to see some of the sector initiatives that are coming up, because that will ultimately address it and can help us meet some of our goals.
Great. Thank you very much, Lene, for that description. And Marc, we haven't forgotten about you. Similar question. Tell us a little bit about Airbus's approach to your carbon neutrality journey, scope 1, 2, and 3, things that you're really proud of, pleased with, and where those challenges might lie.
Thank you very much, and I'm very pleased and honored to be with you in this UNFCCC and 3M panel. I don't know if you know it, but I think it's a little bit unique, but the whole aviation sector is committed to net zero in 2050. IATA, the organization of international airlines, committed to that. So all the members of IATA committed to be carbon neutral for their operation in 2050 2 months ago. And immediately after, within ATAG, which is another association regrouping airports, manufacturers, airlines, and air navigation services, we did the same. And so the whole aviation industry is really committed worldwide to net zero in 2050. As Airbus, as a manufacturer producing more than 50% of the aircraft, commercial aircraft of more than 100 passengers flying in the world, we want to lead this journey to carbon neutrality. For that, we have 4 pillars of actions. The first pillar is technology, of course. If you look at the 30 last years, we improved the performance of our aircraft by 50%. So we reduced by 50% the emission for 100 kilometers per passenger, per pax. To give you an idea of the progress we made today, for a modern aircraft, the CO2 emission per passenger per kilometer is 60 grams, 62 exactly, which is much better than a lot of cars. And so we are at the middle of the journey because we still have to reduce by 50%. And we can probably still improve the existing technology, but we want to go a step further. And this is why we have launched last year a very important project studying a free concept of hydrogen aircraft between 100 to 200 passengers, between 1,000 to 2,000 nautical miles range, to be introduced in the market in 2035. If you use a decarbonized hydrogen as a propulsion for an aircraft, it's not only net zero, it's zero emission of CO2. And so it will be a big change for aviation. The second pillar is the fuels. So for hydrogen aircraft, we need decarbonized hydrogen. This is not specific to aviation. We have to replace 80% of energy coming by fossil fuel by new energies, mainly electricity. And hydrogen is a transformation of green electricity in a fuel that can be burned and with no emission. But the aircraft we are selling today will fly for 20 years. And so we need to find a solution for them. And actually, our aircraft are capable to use by 50% sustainable aviation fuel. And sustainable aviation fuel can reduce emission by 80%. We plan to have 100% capability on SAF by 2030, which means that the current aircraft will be able to fly with 100% sustainable aviation fuel, reducing by 80% their emissions. And so this is for the current fleets. And if you go to what we call P2L, power to liquid, so synthetic fuels, which are produced by green hydrogen, decarbonized hydrogen, and carbon capture, you manufacture a fuel which is just emitting the carbon you have captured in the atmosphere. So it's very close to carbon neutrality.
Okay, I'm going to have to ask you to tell us about 3 and 4 really quickly. You said there were 4 parts.
Yes. The other part is operations. I don't know if we have time for that.
Yeah.
We just inaugurate what we call a fellow fly using the wake vortex of one aircraft. We can reduce the emission by 5%. And the last one is offsetting.
Okay, well, we'll come to that actually.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask you a very specific question about that, if I may. Thank you very much indeed. So, as we heard at the beginning, 4 very different approaches to carbon neutrality from 4 very different industries. But as I was listening to you all, in terms of some of the challenges that you need to grapple with to deal with the carbon emissions from Scope 3, a couple of you at least said that one of the big challenges is just simply the complexity of your supply chains. And Gayle, you talked about the fact that they span different sectors, and some of these sectors, will take. There's just an inherent time factor in switching operations. Particularly represented here on the panel today. We heard the challenge of fragmented supply chains. We heard the challenge of lack of reliable data sometimes in order to figure out emission reduction strategies. And then in some markets, Giovanni, this was your point, the lack of the kind of the incentives that you need. So in some markets, legislation is there, and in others, it's not. So if there are some of the challenges, and they're pretty, big challenges, which is why we're having this conversation about Scope 3, and it's why a lot of attention is being focused on Scope 3. There are some of the challenges. How do we address some of those challenges, knowing that we don't have all of the answers at all? But I'd now like to hear from each of you. How do you see some of these challenges being overcome? And this might be an answer of what is happening and what you hope to happen. So you're allowed to dream a little bit here in your answer to this question. But if I can move us on to some thoughts as to how do we overcome these challenges? And I'll go back to you first, Gayle, if I may.
Okay. Well, you're right. These are daunting challenges. And that's really where it comes to our purpose as an enterprise and the commitment to science and innovation. Because of the diversity of our portfolio, it's really hard to say just one thing or another, because it's different whether we're talking about, a consumer Scotch-Brite sponge or a healthcare product or something that helps enable the renewable energy industry or lightweighting and extending the range on vehicles. But one of the things that I think is really important that we've done that I'm really proud of is the requirement that every new product we launch must have a sustainability value commitment. This has changed. Now, some groups it hasn't changed at all. Quite honestly, there's been some people in our new product development that have always thought this way. But what it's done is it's forced early in the process, that first idea phase, that people need to be thinking about what is the sustainability value commitment. So a customer might come to us and say that they want, a more colorful this or that. Well, that's not going to be their sustainability value commitment. They need to find something else. And so this has really transformed our innovation process process and our conversations with our customers. And ultimately, I believe it will transform our portfolio in the direction that helps us get towards that carbon neutrality piece. It won't happen fast enough. We know we need to do other things as well as that. And it definitely, the way I think about it is that the things we need to focus on are urgency of action, basing it on science, and collaboration. So this needs to be done both with our suppliers and with our customers. And so to me, that's one of the most important levers that we're pulling right now to try to get that to happen.
Okay. Could you tell us a bit more about the sustainability value? Just, is it
I could talk all day about this one.
So 2 minutes.
Okay, 2 minutes. Well, so those of you who know 3M know that we have this 15% culture concept, and that was really our inspiration for sustainability value commitments. The idea in a 15% culture is that anyone in the company can spend up to 15% of their time working on anything they want. And very specifically, not necessarily what their management tells them they should be working on. And now, if we try to get this past our board of directors today, Giovanni, I hear you laughing. No one, if we hadn't already been doing it, no one would allow it, I'm sure, because we're just, too focused on, meeting immediate goals. But if we tried to take it away from 3M today, our board of directors would never let it happen. Because the fact is that almost every innovation in the company, in fact, I've yet to find an exception, every innovation from the company has had some sort of roots in 15% culture. When I first came into the sustainability space, one of the exciting things I learned about was that so many scientists came to me so excited that we had a chief sustainability officer and that we were focusing on sustainability. And they told me things like, I've been spending my 15% time for my entire career working on sustainability. And it's been really exciting to see those scientists now be part of those teams that are driving evolution. So sustainability value commitments are about things we do with new materials, with our suppliers, things we do in our manufacturing processes, reinventing, things we do with our customers, helping them reduce their footprint, whether it's waste or water or carbon, and things that we do to really reinvent businesses. And if you want me to start talking more about, changing old businesses, I'll talk about roofing granules and pulling smog out of the air by cooling your roof. But that's maybe for another time.
I love that, by the way, because personally I'm really interested in the intersectionality of climate and health, and those granules, they're part of the solution. But just going back to sustainability value, what has been the sustainability value commitment that you've seen over, say, the last 12 months that's excited you the most?
Oh, wow. That's tricky. I'll tell you that when we first started, we launched our sustainability value commitments at COP24. And so starting in 2019, it brought forward. And the first things people did was, people who weren't already thinking that way would go to suppliers and say, do you have a recycled version of X? Or do you have a plant-based version of X? Perfectly good solutions, but that's not really the way to totally break through. What I'm excited, one of the things, it's hard to pick a favorite. The roofing granules are great, but I talk about them a lot. But maybe I'll talk about some of the things that are happening right now in our laboratories or in collaboration with others. We're taking multi-layer film technologies that probably most of you carry around every day without knowing it in your cellular phones or see it on your screens. It helps make brighter films or brighter images. It helps make more colorful images. It helps batteries last longer. But now we're finding ways that we're able to reduce the effect of heat underneath surfaces that we can put these films on, where they're reflecting the rays of light in certain ways that help make cooler bus stops or cooler pavilions. And I don't know, it's pretty exciting early on, but there's a lot happening.
Great. Thank you for that. It was just really good to bring that to life. So what I heard there is one of the key approaches at 3M that you're using to deal with this challenge of supply chain complexity is effectively to ask all of your suppliers to adopt a different process, but to really specify that internally. So people within 3M are asking questions that perhaps they weren't asking a while ago of suppliers as a way of really embedding sustainability into the way in which that supply chain works. Good. Excellent. So there's one insight that we can all take away. I'm going to go to Giovanni next. How are you overcoming some of your challenges?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the embedding sustainability into the business, and that's what we are doing. I mean, we are approaching COP3 emission. The challenges at two levels, as an individual and collective actions. As an individual company, our procurement basically has adopted a sustainable procurement models in which they introduce sustainability drivers in all our tenders, in almost all our tenders. More than 80% of our negotiated amount of expenditure basically includes some we call sustainability key factors. Basically, it's a rewarding mechanism that give an advantage, to those suppliers that are more sustainable than others. And that's basically a sort of incentive for them to improve their sustainability performances. And regarding specifically to the CO2 emissions, so we were very active and very pushing in adopting the environmental product declaration. Because environmental product declaration, is a way that we found very useful and effective in, closing the gap that I mentioned before about the data. And basically, that's what we have built together with other players, and we have basically now make it a mandatory for all our suppliers. And that's basically the first point to answer your first question. About when we will be able to if we have a scope 3, target, we're going to have it thanks to this kind of activities that we have done. But there is another level that we are really engaged, also together with 3M. It's about I'm talking about the collective actions. Mm-hmm. We think that this kind of fragmented supply chain, that is a common, a commonality from among different sectors, can be only, tackled only if we work together. And that's why we have launched together with 3M and other 15 founding members, the Global Alliance for Sustainable Energy. Basically, it's an alliance where we want to have an holistic approach. We want to break the silos of each single, player in the supply chain, because we One is, of course, net zero, but we are also targeting human rights, water consumptions, and circular economy, which is another topic very important. It's a very peculiar alliance because it is global. It is focused on the sustainability of renewables, which is something that doesn't exist today, because we know that today renewable energies are this, the answer to the decarbonization of the power sector. Mm-hmm. But we need to work in advance to improve the sustainability of this technology. And the last peculiarity is that we do not want to have on board all industrial players, but this platform is open also to this, to technical partners, university, but also the civil societies. And there are some NGOs like youth organizations that are part of the, of the alliance, and we expect them to challenge us, to challenge the industry, because otherwise we risk just to have, a self-referential, approach, which is not really constructive.
Great, thank you. So a clear message there around the importance of collaboration, collective action as a mechanism to deal with some of the challenges. Lene, to you next. You were sort of hinting that might be one of the ways that as GE Renewable Energy you were thinking about dealing with some of these Scope 3 challenges. Could you pick up that baton of collaborative action and perhaps share another way in which you're dealing with some of those Scope 3 emission challenges?
Yes, I'll highlight perhaps 2 or 3 things actually.
Sorry, Lene, is your microphone working? Maybe just bring it quite close. Hello. Yeah, I think you're going to have to bring it quite close. Sorry.
Is that better? Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
I think we have 2 work streams. One is which is very structured and very data focused, and a bit to what Giovanni was saying, EPDs, life cycle assessments, really trying to understand the impacts throughout the life cycle of the product. They're sort of happening. It's a very meticulous and I would say boring, but that's actually not fair because you really identify the most amazing opportunities as part of it. But at the same time, we're also building the airplane while we fly a little bit. There's a little bit of that because we're launching various projects towards specific parts of our supply chain to identify opportunities for decarbonization. So right now, this year, for instance, we've worked on logistics. So we transport a lot of heavy components around the world in all sorts of modes of transportation, including flights sometimes, but we're trying to avoid it. But actually going into much deeper dialogues with our logistics suppliers has been eye-opening, but also encouraging to me. So of course, there are complexities in all sorts of ways, and it relates to both how we plan, how we procure, how global supply chains work, the availability of various modes of transportations. It is complex. Again, right, to the initial point. But what we're hearing from our suppliers is that they're on it. Both because of these global commitments that we're all part of in our countries, in our industries, etc. But also because they know it's the right thing to do. They see it as license to operate over time. It's just a matter of just how fast it goes. I've heard here for the first couple of days, people who've been to many COPs. This is my first one, but one of the things that came out several times independently is the tone has changed. So there's more focus on the action piece. One thing is the commitments that we need to agree on, very, very important. It sets the framework, right? But there's a huge piece of work in the action afterwards. And I think that's really what we are also seeing in this engagement with our suppliers. We're trying to change the tone. We're a very cost-driven industry. That's not a secret at all. We have to be. We have to have the most competitive product to make renewable energy grow the way it needs to. But we are actually trying to open up the conversation, like Giovanni is also indicating. There are other factors that will play into how we source in the future, and we're really keen to understand what they're doing. Mm-hmm. And a lot of them are doing a lot. I mean, so what is our scope 3 is their scope 1 and 2, and many of them are actually committing to really, really address that. So that's very, very encouraging. So those are two very specific things. And then the last part, again, more of a formalized sort of process kind of thing that I think we just need to do, honestly, is starting to assess our supply chain. So we've partnered up with EcoVadis and launched the first piece of supplier assessments on sustainability. So not just the carbon piece, although it's an important part for us, but a wider set of sustainability metrics. We'll have the first 200 major suppliers to our onshore wind business being assessed this year, and we're gradually going to roll that out so it just becomes the standard. And we need to understand much better who is actually performing really well here. Who can we play with on the sustainability?
Thank you for that. Yes, it's also my first COP. What a one to come to. And yeah, I've heard that dialogue, which is, we now need to beginning to move from these targets to action, which is why this conversation is such a timely one this afternoon. So, Marc, just some thoughts from you in terms of overcoming challenges as Airbus, as a significant player in the aviation industry. If you wanted to talk about carbon offsetting right now, that would be fine. Leave it up to you.
Perhaps a word about the supply chain first, because at Airbus we have more than 20,000 suppliers. First of all, we need innovative suppliers that are helping us to reduce our scope 3. And engine manufacturers, as an example, are very important to help us to do this transformation. Second, we want a responsible supply chain, which means, of course, on environment, but also on human rights and so on. And as many other companies, we go through procurement on that, to have a code of conduct and some objectives that are very clear of our supply chain to be as responsible as we want to be at Airbus. Of course, it's difficult to manage 20,000 suppliers. So regarding the CO2 emission, we are concentrating our efforts today on 100 main suppliers that are representing 70% or so of the activity. And we are asking them to report and to have objectives. And so, doing so, we will engage perhaps not all the supply chain, but the main part of it in the same journey. Regarding offsetting or insetting, because this could be the questions. Today we are doing some offsettings, or business travel as an example. Before that, aviation is fully decarbonized. But of course, we invest also in real reduction of our CO2 emissions. We are looking at insetting to support the supply chain in moving forward. But we need this first step, which is they report their emission, they fix objectives, and then we can see through insetting how they can help them.
Can you, sticking with insetting, and just for the avoidance of any doubt, first of all, just explain to us the difference between offsetting and insetting. But going to insetting, I'm just conscious we have a live stream and not everyone might be up front with the intricacies of the differences. But just quickly give us a quick definition, if you wouldn't mind, for our our live audience. But can you give me an example of an insetting project that you're exploring? That would be brilliant.
As I said, today we have no precise project to
an idea.
do so, but it's clear that rather than offsetting, so buying some offset that will help companies which are not in our domain to help them financing projects that reduce CO2 emission. Why not financing something in our supply chain?
Yes, exactly.
And with a direct impact on this supply chain. I will not say that one is better than the other, because I think offsetting has some value when we help. There are a lot of discussion here about developing emerging country. Our supply chain is extremely large in the world, and sometimes it's good also to offset in some other region or other country. But I think the insetting is a way also to create the momentum within the supply chain and to the benefit of everybody, because globally reduce our impacts, and we can support also the supply chain to move forward on the decarbonization roadmap.
Okay, great. And yeah, I think insetting within your supply chain is definitely one of the ways we can overcome of that need for rapid decarbonisation. So thank you for that. So we've heard some of the challenges associated with Scope 3 emissions through complex supply chains, some of the solutions. We're going to move to that broader enabling context that we need and just explore what do we need to see from policymakers, what might we need to see from investors. Just before we do that, are there any questions from our really delightfully wonderful audience? And yes, we have two. Brilliant. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to you and in the spirit of SDG 17, share my microphone. If you wouldn't mind using it.
Okay, a question. I guess I've heard the word complexity a number of times. So obviously there's the complexity that you face with many, many thousands of suppliers. But I think I sometimes also think of the complexity from the supplier's perspective, where they have numerous clients that they're providing materials to who each have different targets, different data platforms, different requirements, different expectations. So what are you doing within either your company or within your industry or your sector to actually enable your suppliers to be more successful?
Great. And would you mind saying who you are?
Maureen Kasisko, I'm with GSK.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So a question there from the healthcare sector. So any of you like to pick up, I mean, I guess this is a level down in detail in terms of, how you're enabling your suppliers in practical terms. So Giovanni looked game for that, and then maybe Lene. Yes.
Shall I start?
Yes, please.
Sure. Well, there are a lot of actions that can be done. The first thing that we have done years ago, 2-3 years ago, is to talk with suppliers, to listen to their problems, their needs. And we organize every year a sustainability forum for suppliers, where we try to settle, eliminate the differences, of thinking of the needs, because sometimes we have this high view, and then they have more practical difficulties on that, because they have to combine, technical requirements with also sustainability requirements and so on. So the idea was, first of all, talking with them and listening to them, and then working together. And as a result of, as an outcome of the sustainability forums, we have working tables to address specific issues, where we put together the technical aspects and the sustainability aspects, and in order to work together and to find common solutions. Otherwise, actually, you're right. I mean, for them, it could be very, very difficult to be to satisfy all the requirements. That's one of the things that we do.
And let me supplement, and we do similar, I think, I would say, but through the project. So very, very specific. Again, if we look at our logistics suppliers, we would talk to them about quite clearly what are our challenges actually, because we're practicing transparency with them, because some of the asks we might have sometimes for data or whatever it might be, information, right? It's not completely clear to them necessarily why we need it. So we try to actually give them a sense of how it will help us operate. And some of the feedback we get is that they'd like to be included much earlier in the process. So even when we're aware that there's projects coming up, can we actually pull them in and start to think about how do we design the most efficient zero carbon? Zero carbon is a big ambition, right? But a lower carbon supply chain. So that's one thing. And the other is actually the reason why we partnered up with EcoVadis. It was to have some sort of a standardized approach to how we would engage the supply chains. And also knowing that it has been around for so long, many of our suppliers already use the platform, and they don't have to take on an extra burden to fill it out just for us, because we have others in our industry who ask the same kind of questions and use the same methodology.
Yeah, Gayle.
So I appreciate the question, actually, because I feel sometimes like we're in the sandwich of this, where we have to work with our suppliers, but then we're supplied to others who are asking, and keeping track of the data and being able to respond consistently, especially from a global basis. You know, if we have a customer in Korea who's asking a question that's the same as a question coming in Chile, are we confident that we're really giving them the right answer and it's consistent around the board across every business that we work in? So I appreciate the pain of the question. And I would say that, like Giovanni, we do have an annual supplier summit. We give awards to our suppliers who, you know, to incent the behavior that we're looking for. And like Marc mentioned, we have a top tier set of suppliers where we're working very carefully on very specific things to really advance every day. And like Lene said, I'm a fan of things that help bring it together. So EcoVadis is a great example of that. Sometimes we're working with the CDP data for our suppliers that submit to CDP. And we're really always looking to do more. We have some things internally that we have pulled together to help keep the data consistent so that it can go out and we get the same answer going out in every region of the world across every business. But it is a real challenge. And one of the things that I would say we find challenging in particular right now that has been emerging and growing is that we'll have customers that want to know the specific carbon footprint or the specific water footprint of their particular product. And you know, we'll report on an annual basis what we do as an enterprise. We have in our internal databases down to certain geographies or certain business lines, but down to every single product is at the 55,000 plus product level is something that we're finding to be complex. So, you know, we do some things, you know, where we can simplify. We know this type of tape manufacturing has this sort of baseline, or we can estimate this raw material versus that raw material. But it is a very complex situation, and we do count on things, I mean, like the EcoVadis platform or others that can help pull the data together. And what we also try to work on is, as a supplier ourselves and negotiating with our customers, to help ask for things in a format that is more common rather than having it be unique to their individual company. It's a tricky question.
Great, thank you. And I really hear the importance of a standardized approach. Really, really important. Makes it a lot easier to get the data that you need. Question at the back right now, yes?
Yes, good afternoon. We understand this is a COP of the how we do have to deliver, so COP26. So I would like to have, if you can share with us, all of you, what you will bring back to your company, to your leadership, to your employees, maybe one or two very concrete next steps for any of your four great companies. Thank you. My name is Maxime Bureau from 3M.
Just for completeness, thank you. Great question. So one or two things that you're taking back from this whirlwind in Glasgow back into your business. I'd love to hear the answer to that question. And then I will move us on to sort of policy and investment, because I'd like to kind of pull together a picture that talks about what you can do in terms of your direct controls, but what also needs to happen in that wider enabling environment. So that's where we're going to go next. But in the meantime, Giovanni, what are you taking away from Glasgow?
I think that also this panel is strengthen the fact that we have to cooperate. We have to break the silos. We have to work together, because at the end of the day, even Enel in this case, in the upper part of the supply chain, where we have customers, we have clients, we are squeezed as well, as you said before. And we definitely need to work more together, and also to try to be more innovative on that. You know, this morning I had an interesting conversation with a European Spatial Agency. You can ask yourself why you are talking about, spatial with space. You are on the ground. You are, you're installing a ground-mounted solar panel, and there are a lot of ideas that can come from the cooperation. And we need to be more innovative and to use innovation in order to improve the sustainability. And that's the thing that I'm bringing back home.
That's a very good thing to take home with you. I'm just going to move down the line. Gayle?
Wow. So I agree. This is not my first COP, but I'm very excited that it does feel like the COP of how. How can we do more? How can we do better? It's less the question of what whether we should do it, who's going to be in, but how do we go about doing this? So I've really appreciated a number of sessions that I've been able to attend about some of the mechanics of it. To the last question, how do we measure? How do we track this? How do we make sure that we're making progress without unintended consequences? The next one, so that gets kind of that science space. Then if we go to the urgency space, how fast can we do this? There's been some great breakthroughs that I've been hearing about, some really exciting things that are happening in all different places, in all different industries. How can we bring those back and learn and help accelerate what we're doing? And then it gets back to the collaboration that we've been talking at. How can we better collaborate with others to make that happen? And I guess that overlaps with the innovation piece too. But gone are the days that one company can drive on their own and make progress. We really need to in order to make the big progress, we need to be going together. And that's something I'm particularly excited about, is some of the new opportunities that we're seeing here.
Great, thank you, Gayle. Marc, next, what will you be taking away?
The momentum in the industry.
Yeah.
I said in aviation we are all unified on the common objective. GE and 3M are very important suppliers of Airbus, and when you see how they are committed to sustainability, we can just be trustful in the future, But I think it's not totally new, but the level of momentum in the industry, I observed also 2 years ago, it struck me that perhaps the industry, because we need the long-term vision. When you need to manufacture aircraft that will fly for 20 years. When you have to invest in billions of euro in new technology, you have to plan for the future. And it's so obvious for us that we cannot plan for the future without giving priority to sustainability. And I just do hope that this momentum in the industry will be shared by all the participants to this COP.
Great. What uplifting answers we're getting. Lene, are you going to go away uplifted with something to do differently?
Ooh, uplifted. I'm going to be super transparent, because we said we would have a candid conversation. I think it's going too slow. And so I'm very keen to understand what is the barrier. And I ultimately think, because I reflected a lot about this and also been in the front line of working to do change in the business for a long time, it's actually, I think there are the new skill sets that we need to embrace in our leadership, and also more diversity into decision making and in our organizations in general. I mean, we're big companies, we have structures and ways we have done things, and I agree innovation is critical. We all have pockets of innovation everywhere, and also some really brilliant things. GE certainly has a legacy of innovating technologies and solving some of the world's most pressing challenges, and still I think we can do more, frankly. So bring more diverse perspectives to the table. I'm going to push even harder for that when I come back home, because I see it here as well. It's one of the critical enablers for really moving forward.
Great, a really great answer. And effectively what we're talking about in terms of decarbonisation within Scope 3, within supply chains, that's part of a broader systemic shift from an economy powered by fossil fuels to an economy running on green energy. And systemic change is characterized by collaboration, by new ways of doing things, by, yes, momentum, but also by different perspectives. Great systemic change happens when we understand the different perspectives of the different actors in the system. So thank you for that. Well, talking about the systemic nature of this challenge and the recognition that as organizations in the private sector, there's a lot you can do working individually, a lot you can do working collaboratively. I'd like it to think more about now that wider enabling environment. The private sector on its own isn't going to manage to get to net zero, no matter how much we would hope that would be the truth, but it isn't. So I'd like to turn first to policy. And I'm going to turn to you first, Giovanni, if I may. If we had policymakers in the room, and we might, you never know, who knows? They're not very far away anyway, so you could talk really loud. But what is it that you need to see from policymakers to really enable this journey to carbon neutrality?
Well, this is a very $1 billion question, because there are a lot of things that have to be addressed. But if we think of the renewable business, the first thing that comes into my mind is basically to make the ambition a reality. What I mean is that today, in order to achieve the goals for renewable business, for the renewable that every country or every state is setting as a target, there has to be create a sense of urgency. And what is happening instead is that today the challenge or the barrier is not the cost of the technology, because today the renewable technologies are much more convenient than any other source of any other type of technology for power generation. The problem is that the fact that there is they have to work on the acceptance of the plants. You know, the bottleneck, the barrier is that people, they started to complain against the solar and wind industry and the solar plants. So there should be an extra effort to work on the acceptance and also to close the gap between the country targets and the benefits or the burden that the region and the local people, the local communities, they get when the plant is built. Because the solar plant, the wind plant is a local plant, while the target for the country and for decarbonization, they talk about economies, the entire economy, the whole economy of the countries. This is for the business of renewables. For the Scope 3 emissions, as I said before, they should find some incentive mechanisms. Like, I'm not talking necessarily about money. I'm just talking about making something that makes more attractive decarbonize. And one of these mechanisms, or one of these areas where they can work, is the third point, is about circular economy. You mentioned at the beginning, I think, in your introduction, a significant share of emissions are released in the first part of the value chain for mining and processing the raw materials. So having or pushing on circular economy means not only to decrease the environmental footprint, but also indirectly to cut emissions. And there is a lot of value that is locked today by the linear economy. And we set for ourselves targets and objectives in order to redesign our business, our part of the value chain, because we believe there is a lot of value that will be unlocked. But this is definitely an issue that circular economy is transversal. And that's why we put it as a priority for the Global Alliance for Sustainable Energy, and for me, it should be the priority also for policymakers.
And try and make this real for me, if you can. If we did indeed have a policymaker in front of us right now, and we wanted to ask for something specific to enable the circular economy, what would it be?
Well, I mean, mechanism just to incentivize those, set targets first and clear objectives. That is something that is probably missing,
Okay.
Set targets starting from the design of the products, more ambitious target. I'm looking at you, but also at ourselves. And also making this more attractive, because at the end of the day, if you get a benefit when you sell a product because it's circular, then you are more incentivized to revise, to redesign your product, In other words, there should be a sort of initial effort, to break the barriers, to change the current processes. Because at the end, if you look at the life cycle of the products, a circular product in general is more convenient than a linear product. If you look at a single piece of the value chain, probably not. For instance, if GE asks for fully recyclable blades, which is the only part of the wind turbine that is not recyclable, they say, okay, today it costs more. Today, yes. But if you look at the entire value chain and we think what happens when a high Enel have to dispose it off, probably we get a benefit on that,
Yeah.
And the way is how to share this benefit, probably.
Yeah.
Because there is a gap, a temporal gap, a time gap between when you design a product and you dispose it off.
Yeah. So, for example, if there was policy that encouraged the internalization of some of these externalities, that would be super helpful, wouldn't it?
That could be.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I hope they're somewhere close by and they heard that. So thank you very much. Anyone else have an ask from policy before we move on to investors? Marc.
Perhaps aviation sector is a little bit specific because it's very international.
Yes.
And we can see a lot of actions at national or regional level with the EU Green Deal in the EU, with some support to research in France, Germany, UK, etc. But what is missing is a global view. And we have the chance to have one UN body, which is ICAO, which can, and there will be a very important discussion next year in the ICAO Assembly with the 193 states, And it's interesting to have this global approach on top of national approach, because we need a level playing field, and we have a global view to embark the whole aviation industry at international level. If not, you will create difficulties in competition and so on, which are very difficult to address. So I think it's good that states are thinking about themselves and going fast in their projects. But international aviation is a good example where we need to think global, and this is also the reason for this COP, and trying to find sometimes some solution on a more global level, not only on very political side, but how to drive the industry in the right direction.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important point there about the connectivity between regional, national, and international policy, and the fact that sometimes they aren't connected, they're not nested in the way that they need to be. And so then you get all these perverse incentives and sort of schisms in practice. So thank you for shining a light on that. And yes, like you, I'm sure we all are hoping that this COP really sets that blueprint for the international policy, from carbon trading to rechanneling subsidies, and that flows down into all the different policy areas, and we get that sort of nested nature, which is perhaps missing in some areas at the moment. Okay, that's a quick foray into policy. Anyone else want to share anything on policy? You just want to move to investment, right? So obviously, you know, in all of our work at Forum, and we spend a lot of our time trying to understand how do we shift systems, two key enablers. One is policy, particularly when a system is stabilizing. So particularly right now in energy, we're going to need new policy to sort of stabilize the transition that we've seen over the last few years, and one that's really accelerating in real time. So policy, really important lever for systemic change, but so is access to capital. And I think one of the reasons for optimism, certainly that I have observed in this particular COP and in conversations this week and last week in the blue zone, in the green zone, in the side events, was the realization and the understanding that that capital now might be coming available. You know, the transition to net zero is going to require some capital investment. So the role of investment, super critical for decarbonisation. To you, Gayle, what is it that you need from the investment community?
Well, we work with investors all the time, and we know that the bar has risen, and there's, you know, never, for those of us as chief sustainability officers, I'll tell you, there's never been more excitement and energy in this space. So it's something we pay a lot of attention to. I think that I'm encouraged by, you know, what we're hearing with the investment community about the idea of the non-financial metrics, whether it's environmental or social or governance, ESG metrics, those will become financial metrics. It feels kind of like a wake-up call and a recognition that that's happening. And so what that's meaning is that there is an impact on investment in companies. There's also an impact on the priorities internally in companies. You know, when we were developing our math with a path to figure out how we could advance those bold goals on carbon and on water, we realized that there was tremendous interplay between the two. The actions that we needed and wanted to take to impact our water footprint, they were in many cases the same types of actions, the same investments that we needed to make for carbon. And so by recognizing the overlap, developing that path together, you know, we made a commitment to a $1 billion investment. That's a big deal, you know, to be going in that space when we also are prioritizing investing for growth and investing for efficiency. So it's really critical that we focus in those capital spaces, and that ESG gets that kind of attention. It really helps drive the actions within the company towards a more sustainable effort.
Yeah, and I've heard this a lot from the chief sustainability officers with whom we engage with at Forum, that, you know, 2-3 years ago, they very rarely were asked any questions from their investor relations team, and now that's where they spend a lot of their time. Is that true for you as well?
Absolutely. You know, I actually find it really exciting and energizing to work with our investor relations team. They're always the face on it. That's better that way. But having those discussions with real investors where they're really wanting to understand the details. You know, I remember some calls maybe 4 and 5 years ago where if you said scope 1, 2, and 3, like we've been talking about so transparently in this, you had to explain that to investors. Now they're asking me, you know, what does this mean, and how is your strategy, and what does that mean from one business to another, and what about the timelines on things? The questions that the investment community is asking now have really advanced tremendously, and not a week goes by that there's not an investor discussion that I'm involved with.
Yeah. I mean, that's just so great to hear, because it used to be a source of, you know, some despair that the investor relations team, you know, weren't paying that much attention to what was happening in sustainability. And I find it even more fascinating that this is a trend that's accelerated in the middle of a global pandemic. So the trillions of dollars under ESG, I think it doubled last year in the middle of a pandemic. So there's definitely a real sea change happening there. But moving to you, Lene, if I can, what is it that you would like to see from the investment community to accelerate your ambitions at GE?
Well, actually, I think it ties very much to what you said, Gayle. We are certainly also seeing a much stronger interest from our investors, and that is actually helping. I mean, that is accelerating, obviously, because they're a very important stakeholder group. So it helps direct attention to where it needs to be, and also it is painful. I mean, let's just be frank, right? Because having a wide range of metrics and having to explain that in the most transparent way possible, it does take time, and it does, back to the point about skills and really trying to look holistically across your risks and opportunities, and then communicate. That's an exercise. But I think it's welcome. We certainly welcome the interest, and we think it's right, and it's obviously also because it's becoming a commercial imperative, and it's about risk. It's about managing your risk over time, and climate change is the biggest single risk that we're all facing.
And so that, you know, speaks to the point of engagement with investors is really important. If you had a magic wand and you were in a conversation with your key investors right now, I mean, so we have to go into the realms of imagination here a little bit, but just curious to know, what is it specifically you need from investors right now? I mean, it could be a shift in mindset, it could be access to patient capital, but what is it that would accelerate your progress at GE?
That is a very good question, Sally. I'm not sure I have the perfect answer for that. And I think, honestly, it of course also depends on the nature of the investor, right? But it's clearly direction. It is, you know, what do they expect? What do they want to see from us on ESG performance over time? And hopefully be confirmed that is also what we're focusing on. And if not, we can certainly have, you know, the ability to change. But it's a closer dialogue.
Yeah.
Most likely.
Yeah.
Where it starts, right? And
great.
Direction.
And so this theme of dialogue is popping up a lot in this conversation, isn't it? That's really interesting. We're channeling SDG 17 here in terms of collaboration and dialogue. Okay, so we have explored some of the challenges associated with Scope 3, some of the ways we might deal with those challenges. We've had a little foray into what we need from policy, what we might need from investors. Are there any other questions we have in the audience? Because we're keen to involve you. If you have any further questions, thoughts, insights, yes. Let me come over to you. If you wouldn't mind sharing your name before you share your insight or your question.
I'm Louise Horsfall. I'm Professor of Sustainable Biotechnology at the University of Edinburgh. And I was very taken with Giovanni bringing in the circular economy. I think it's incredibly important, and I'd like to hear from some of the other speakers on that topic and how you consider end of life within your products that you're manufacturing and where that thinking is at the moment.
Great. Brilliant. We like the circular economy very, very much. So thank you for that excellent question. So who'd like to pick up the question, which is, what happens to your products at the end of their life, and how are you making the circular economy a reality? Who'd like to hop in first?
Yes, thank you. This is a very important question, and I think for the whole industry, we are working hard on that. As far as Airbus is concerned, we have invested in the south of France in manufacturing to recycle, and more than 90% of their aircraft are already recyclable and recycling. And we do hope to do more. And now, of course, the recycling, it's involved at the very beginning of the design of the aircraft. So that when we use a new substance, a new design, we have a clear view of what it will become at the end. Obviously, for the cabin and so on, we will design it in such a way that it's even more than 90% recyclable. So I think it's really something which is now part of our responsibility. And so in Airbus, we do not just want to do it in the way it's recyclable. We really invest with other companies, partners, to develop the facilities that will then recycle the aircraft.
Great, thank you, Gayle.
Sure. So circular economy is another one that I could talk about for days. I love this topic. First, before I go into it, I have to tell you the story of when we developed the strategic sustainability framework I mentioned earlier. We were all about science. It was science for circular, science for climate, science for community. When we brought it, before it went public, one of the groups that I really prioritized running it by in order to get their input is our corporate scientist group, so the senior, most expert scientists in the company. And so this was 2018. And we're based obviously in the United States. So I ran it across this 35 people. And I was scared from the US of what they were going to say about science for climate. What I was surprised by is they were already there on climate. That wasn't a problem at all. So that was a huge relief. But what they spent their time discussing was science for circular. Because they didn't know what circular was. They didn't know what a circular economy was. So I had to really bite my tongue and let them argue amongst themselves, super intelligent people. And they were Googling it, and they were saying, what do other people call this? I mean, they understood the concept, and they thought the concept was really important, but circular felt like we were running in circles. It felt like, circular arguments. This wasn't a good thing. By the end of that 35 minutes, they had Googled enough, they had argued enough, and they were huge proponents for the concept of a circular economy. That could not have been better for our company because then we had the top scientists in the company who were suddenly espousing the importance of a circular economy, a word that they didn't know 2 hours beforehand. And so what's been happening is more and more, I will tell you that, in the last 3 years, the concept of circular economy has come a tremendously long way. And I have to smile every time I see someone internally talk about it because it wasn't in our vernacular commonly 3 years ago, and now it is. So we're specifying out renewable content, Scotch-Brite sponges, 100% renewable scouring surfaces, Thinsulate, down-free insulation and bedding and jackets, now 100% renewable or recycled content, switching more to plant-based materials. For that, it's a little tricky because plant-based materials are lovely in many, many ways, but you have to watch the carbon footprint, to make sure you're not having one of those unintended consequences. But the whole circular economy piece, bringing into our customer discussions, I am so proud that we have that as a pillar in our sustainability framework, just one of 3, because it just brings in a whole new discussion. And it's a very exciting discussion that, advanced recycling, so many different factors that, just 3 years ago were so new. And now they're becoming commonplace in our discussion. So we're closer to the beginning than the end on this, to be sure. But really looking at so many things we do internally with things that would normally be a byproduct or end of life. Can I share one example?
I was going to say, I'd love to hear an example of maybe a product take-back scheme, or where are you with take-back?
I'll tell you, the one that I'm most excited about, in part because I never saw it coming, is, so we do Paretos for all of these things in our business, and we focus on the biggest impactful ones, and then we try to, across the board, get everybody to raise their game however they can. So when it came to science for circular, a big profile for this is where are our, I'm not supposed to use the word waste, where are the byproducts that are unintended in our manufacturing? And on a weight basis, it might surprise you, it was a little bit unexpected to me, but shouldn't have been. The highest item in our Pareto from a weight perspective was actually the byproducts from our roofing granules business. So there's nothing toxic about it. It's not a problem. It goes right back into the landfill. What they are is particles that are too small to be used as roofing granules. So that team is incredibly innovative. They started to look at, okay, we don't like being number one on the Pareto for waste. How do we get off of this? And what they started looking at is where are small particles used. A lot of times they're very uniform small particles. And they found that natural pozzolans, anybody know what pozzolans are?
You might need to tell us.
Yeah, I did not know either. Those are the very small cementitious material that go into concrete. And they have to be in a certain size range. Well, it turns out that if you're making roofing granules, the byproduct is in the right size range for going into cement. And so by using this material, which we're now selling as a product, so using this material helps offset 3/4 of the carbon footprint of making concrete. So we do not have enough to supply the world's demand, but we have some really exciting programs that we're doing close to our manufacturing sites, because that makes sense when you're moving that amount of weight. But it's really these natural pozzolans is a new way of offsetting for cement in the concrete building business. And I'm super proud of that team, because they are taking their waste that was the highest on the portfolio, on the Pareto chart, down to being something they're making money from. So it's pretty exciting for us as a business.
That is pretty genius, because the embedded carbon in concrete is pretty intense. Brilliant. Anyone else have anything to add on circular economy? Lena?
I think I have to pick up on the blade recycling one, Giovanni, in that context. And also circular economy is often framed as just end of life, but it's just so much more than that. And it also links back to the point we need to have people who can actually articulate and understand, the hierarchies of waste, and that we can do a lot even before it becomes end of life. But for the wind turbines, which is the very vast majority of our products, the blades do present a specific challenge. And it's actually not because they're not recyclable, they're just not recycled. And it is in part because the right structure, the right infrastructure, the right scale is just not available. And that links to the first part about policies and financing, and how do you build a new system, basically, to enable this shift to a circular economy. But what we've done for the blades specifically, so we have two streams. One is what we do with the existing blades operating today, which will gradually start to come down, because the first ones are starting to age, and the fleet it does need replacement in some cases. Again, back to scale, it's not so much yet that it's really a viable business model. So that's a challenge in its own right? But we partnered up with waste treatment companies. So we have a partnership in the US, for instance, with Veolia, where, similar to your example actually, Gayle, where we take the blades down, they go into cement co-processing. So you chop them down into smaller pieces, and you basically burn them, in a cement kiln. But you're able to utilize the material from that, and also the heat it generates, so it replaces fossil fuel burned. So it also reduces the CO2 impact of cement production by about 27% when we did DLCA on it. So it's better. It's not ideal, right? I mean, we don't want to burn thing ideally, which could be a resource. So that's actually a great point. Someone said, it's not waste, it's a resource. And that's the way we have to start thinking about all the waste today that we generate, because we will need to. Also, as an industry, again, in order to grow, there just won't be enough of the kind of materials we'll need to do that sustainably. So we have to rethink the way we operate, all of us.
Thank you for that. For two reasons. Rethinking, really important. And you reminded me of a quote I heard a long time ago, but it's still really true. There is no way. There is, we don't need any waste really ultimately in the system. We have got about 6.5 minutes left of this conversation. We've got time for one more question. Great. If you wouldn't mind saying your name and speaking to the microphone.
Thank you. My name is Anita. I'm with the Evercity Sustainability Measurement and Investment Platform. And my question is probably more relevant for the European companies. There is now a new regulation, the EU taxonomy. So I want to ask to which extent it is driving more change in what the companies do in terms of manufacturing, or is it just another reporting framework and the companies are already doing enough to be aligned with the taxonomy? Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. So yes, the question for those of you operating in Europe, what impact will the EU Green New Taxonomy have on your approach, if any, or are you already doing it? Lene, you're nodding sagely.
Already doing it would be an overstatement, but we're certainly looking at it, and we do see it as a driver, of course, again, for where will investment go. So we're looking at it, and it's tied very, very strongly to this ability to understand the life cycle impacts of our products and our operations. That's a major thing. So we haven't figured that out yet, but we're certainly following very, very closely to understand what do we need to be able to report on in the future to be investable, frankly.
Yeah.
I think not going to be overnight, but the changes happen.
This taxonomy word, as a biologist, it's taken me a while to realize what it actually means. It's basically about a clearer definition of what's needed, and super important when, as you say, you're talking about investment decisions. Anyone else have anything to comment?
I
Giovanni?
think that the goal of the directive is clear in this is positive, because there is a lot of greenwashing around, and from the perspective of a business that is based on environment, I mean, that's CO2 free, it's very important to avoid any type of greenwashing. It depends on how it will be applied, of course, as everything. So it can become a burden, it can become an opportunity. I don't know where we are. I mean, we are going to land with this tech, but it's positive. I find it very, very positive, just to reduce the risk of greenwashing.
So you're saying might not have all the answers, but it's a positive development.
It's a positive development to try to say what is sustainable, what is not sustainable. That's the goal of the directive. How it will be implemented is that it can make the difference. That's basically.
Anyone? Gayle? No? Marc?
I think Marc wanted to say something.
Yes. It's about how far we go in regulation. As we said, investors are already very aware and directing investment towards sustainability. Do we need on top of that regulation to guide the investors or on top of what they're doing? I don't know. This is, yes, what is happening today in Europe mainly. It's not something we see largely in the world. So regarding aviation, the discussion are ongoing, by the way. But I think it doesn't change what is happening in the world, that the investors are directing the investment on activities that they consider as sustainable, because sustainable means that not only it will respect climate and environment, but they will go on in the future. An investor wants to invest in something that is sustainable anyway. So we have to be careful, I think, in the way we want to regulate everything. Because, as I said, in the private sector, I think the dynamics, the momentum is there.
Yeah.
And I can tell you that our investments, of course, are guided by our objective and our commitment on the environment, but also by the request of our investors. So this is existing everywhere in the world. And to put on top of that regulation, yes, why not? But this is a little bit specific to Europe today.
Yeah.
And I was just going to build. I know that you were focused on the European companies. As a global company where we're monitoring regulations and laws all over the world, I'm excited to pay attention to where different types of regulations are happening. The EU Green Deal is certainly at the forefront from a global perspective, and all the eyes of the world are on what's happening with that. But there's also things that are popping up in other parts of the world. I'm encouraged by some of the single-use plastics bans that we're seeing in Kenya or Malawi or other parts of the world, really seeing those reinventions. So there's a lot of things that are happening, but I think we all need to pay attention to what's happening around the world, and it's complex too.
Thank you, Gayle. That's brilliant. In our last remaining couple of minutes, I want to try and do two things. I will try and summarize some of the insights for how we can really accelerate progress on manufacturing emissions, Scope 3 emissions. Just before I do that, I'd like to ask each of you in turn for your COP26 wish for the one thing that you think would accelerate Scope 3 decarbonisation. And it can be something that you're doing, something you've already mentioned, or it could be something that you're dreaming of. But your COP26 wish, the one thing that you think would really help accelerate decarbonisation in Scope 3. Just 10, 15 seconds each. And I guess go when you have an answer to the question. Real quick, the one thing that pops into your mind, what thing would accelerate?
Okay,
Well
we're
done,
dreaming
Gayle.
now, but this is full supply chain transparency, end to end, to really understand that there's mathematical challenges
Yeah.
there's conceptual challenges
Great.
but to really understand, including
Brilliant.
the trade-offs.
That was the kind of dream I was after. So there we go. Your dream, Giovanni.
It is the first challenge that I described
Yeah.
before. I mean, the transparency and the track of the information is also my dream.
Great.
I'll go next. Well, linked to that, so I will say the challenge is just get going, and it actually starts by understand your own impact. And I can see even when we engage with our supply chain, even with the urgency and the COP going on, it's not everyone that started. Just get going. There's guidance out there.
Great. Marc, your dream?
Yes, there are a lot of figures and commitment on CO2 emission, which is, of course, essential. But it is not said how to achieve this. And for me, the critical element is about the production of decarbonized energy. And I think we would need more commitment, more figures on that, and not only on CO2 emissions.
Great. Thank you all very much. Before I say thank you to you all formally, I've been listening really hard and trying to pull out some insights for how we might tackle Scope 3. And I've got 6, and I've somehow made them spell carbon. So I've got an acronym here. Some bits are better than others, I have to say. But C, first letter of carbon, really super easy. C is collaboration, was such a strong theme from the dialogue. Or C could have been for collective action, but definitely that's one thing that has come out loud and clear that might accelerate progress towards Scope 3. A is for approach, standardization thereof. Really important insight that we talked about earlier. R is room to innovate. I love the 15%, but that room to innovate, to think differently, think big, I think is going to be really critical to solving some of this complexity in Scope 3. B is for build sustainability into everything, every operation, every standardized protocol, everything that you do. O is open to challenge. You mentioned that, Giovanni, but kind of being open to different perspectives. You talked about that too, Lene. Kind of being open to challenge perspectives as we kind of problem solve for this big challenge. N was probably the least impressive. But N, I decided in the end to use poetic license, is now is the time. This is an urgent challenge, and that's why the conversation this afternoon has been so brilliant. But we heard the word urgency, and unfortunately, I can't get that into carbon, so I went for now is the time. But I think now is really the time to double down on Scope 3. Someone else's Scope 3 is someone else's Scope 1. If we can tackle Scope 3 and tackle that complexity, then we'll get accelerated progress to net zero. So 6 takeaways, they somehow spell carbon. Hope that was useful, but what I'd like to do finally is to say thank you very much to the panelists. You've been great. It was an interesting conversation, and we had lots of distractions, but I think we paid attention, we stayed on tune, stayed on message, and your insights were really valuable, and what an important conversation to have at what an important moment in time. So thank you all very much.